Crystal chandeliers trembled under the weight of forced laughter as Beatrice stared at the red wine rapidly sinking into the silk of her dress. Eleanor Sterling leaned in, her signature perfume, a suffocating cloud of synthetic roses, and whispered, "People like you simply do not belong in our world, dear. You're merely a charity case." Nathaniel picked up to rebel against his father. Beatrice didn't cry. She didn't run away in shame. Instead, a cold, sharp smile graced her lips. In exactly 3 minutes, the master of ceremonies would take the stage to announce the gala's anonymous billionaire benefactor. Eleanor was about to find out exactly whose world she was standing in. Money, they say, talks. But wealth true, generational wealth whispers. Beatrice Hayes preferred the whisper. To the untrained eye, the 26-year-old was nothing more than a quiet, meticulous restorer of antique manuscripts, spending her days breathing in the scent of aging parchment and binding glue in a small, dust-moted shop in downtown Boston. She wore faded denim, oversized knit sweaters, and kept her dark hair tied back with a simple tortoiseshell clip. She lived in a modest walk-up apartment, drove a reliable 10-year-old sedan, and bought her coffee from the corner bodega. Nathaniel Sterling, on the other hand, was a walking, talking megaphone for new money. Heir to Sterling Global, a massive real estate and private equity conglomerate, Nathaniel drove a silver Aston Martin, wore bespoke Italian suits that cost more than a teacher's annual salary, and had his last name plastered on hospital wings and university libraries. When Nathaniel first walked into Beatrice's shop, holding a water-damaged first edition of The Great Gatsby, a careless casualty of a yacht party, he had expected a transactional exchange. Instead, he found himself utterly captivated by the woman behind the counter. Beatrice didn't fawn over his watch or recognize his famous last name. She scolded him for mistreating a piece of history and charged him double for the rush job. Nathaniel was instantly smitten. For 8 months, their romance was a secret haven. Nathaniel found solace in Beatrice's quiet, grounded world, far away from the cutthroat boardrooms and the sycophantic socialites his parents constantly shoved in his direction. Beatrice, in turn, loved Nathaniel's hidden vulnerabilities, the boyish charm beneath the corporate armor, and his genuine, if somewhat oblivious, heart. But a relationship with a Sterling could only remain hidden for so long. The trouble began the moment Nathaniel decided it was time for Beatrice to meet his family. The setting was the Sterling estate in the Hamptons, a sprawling, ostentatious, glass and steel monstrosity that looked less like a home and more like an oligarch's fortress. Beatrice had arrived wearing a simple, tasteful navy dress. It was a vintage piece from her grandmother's closet, completely devoid of visible logos. To the Sterlings, an absence of logos meant an absence of funds. So, Beatrice, Eleanor Sterling, Nathaniel's mother, had drawled over a plate of imported white truffles. Eleanor was a woman whose face had been pulled so tight by expensive surgeons that her default expression was one of permanent disdain. Nathaniel tells us you work with old books. How? Quaint. Is that a hobby? Or does it actually pay enough to cover rent in the city? Nathaniel had laughed nervously, oblivious to the venom. Mom, Bea is an artisan. Her work is incredible. I'm sure it is, darling, Eleanor replied, not taking her icy blue eyes off Beatrice. But one has to wonder about ambition. In our circle, we value drive, growth, building a legacy. Richard Sterling, Nathaniel's father, a man whose resting heart rate seemed permanently tied to the Dow Jones, chimed in without looking up from his phone. Speaking of legacy, Nathaniel, the Centennial Gala is next month. The board expects you to finalize the Rothford estate acquisition by then. If we don't secure their capital, the European expansion is dead in the water. I'm working on it, Dad, Nathaniel sighed, his posture stiffening. The Rothford representatives are notoriously secretive. They don't even have a public CEO, just a trust operated by a ghost. Beatrice took a slow, deliberate sip of her sparkling water. The ghost Richard and Nathaniel were referring to was none other than the Duke of Rothford, her late grandfather, and the famously secretive Rothford estate a centuries-old European land and banking empire, with assets that made Sterling Global look like a lemonade stand, was entirely under her control. Beatrice was not just Beatrice Hayes. She was Lady Beatrice Arabella Cavendish. She had dropped her title and assumed her middle name and her mother's maiden name to escape the suffocating weight of her lineage, moving to America to build a life where she was valued for her skills, not her bank account. She had sworn to herself that the man she married would love her for who she was, not for the empire she commanded. But sitting at that dining table, watching the Sterlings dismiss her as a peasant, Beatrice realized she was playing a dangerous game. The microaggressions only escalated. Over the next few weeks, Nathaniel's younger sister, Chloe, a vicious 22-year-old socialite with 1 million Instagram followers and a heart made of dry ice, made it her personal mission to ostracize Beatrice. Chloe would constantly accidentally leave Beatrice off group texts, forget to introduce her at parties, and openly flaunt Victoria Harrington, a billionaire shipping heiress and Nathaniel's ex-girlfriend, right in front of Beatrice's face. Victoria and Nate were just made for each other, Chloe said loudly at a country club brunch, ensuring Beatrice could hear every word. They speak the same language. You know, the language of success. It's so sad when people try to date out of their tax bracket. It never works. It just ends up looking pathetic. Nathaniel, blinded by his lifelong conditioning to avoid family conflict, would wave off his family's behavior. They're just protective, Bea, he would say, kissing her forehead. They're high stress right now because of this Rothford deal. Once the gala is over, they'll calm down and see how amazing you are. Beatrice wanted to believe him. She loved Nathaniel. But as the Sterling Foundation Centennial Gala approached, the atmosphere turned toxic. A week before the event, Beatrice received a call from Arthur Pendleton, the senior trustee and chief legal counsel for the Rothford estate. Arthur had been like a second father to Beatrice, since her actual parents passed away in a plane crash when she was a teenager. "My lady," Arthur's crisp British accent echoed through the phone. "Richard Sterling has submitted his final proposal for the capital injection. He is desperate. His company is over-leveraged by nearly $1 billion. Without the Rothford backing, Sterling Global will face severe restructuring, possibly bankruptcy, within the year." Beatrice stared out the window of her bookshop, watching the rain slick the Boston streets. "And what does he offer in return, Arthur?" 51% voting rights in his European division, a seat on his executive board, and the naming rights to the new London Tower. Arthur read from the dossier. He is practically begging. He has also requested that the head of the Rothford Trust make a public appearance at his centennial gala to announce the partnership. He believes it will stabilize his stock prices. Beatrice's eyes narrowed. Richard Sterling was perfectly willing to grovel to a faceless European aristocrat, yet he treated the woman his son loved like dirt beneath his expensive loafers. "Tell him the Rothford Trust accepts," Beatrice said softly. "Excellent. I shall draft the preliminary agreements," Arthur said. "And who shall I say will be attending the gala on behalf of the trust?" Beatrice looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the window. "Tell him the primary shareholder will be there in person. And Arthur, make sure the master of ceremonies has my full legal title." The grand ballroom of the Beaumont Hotel was a master class in aggressive opulence. 10,000 white orchids cascaded from the vaulted ceilings. Waiters in white tie attire glided across the marble floors, carrying silver trays of beluga caviar and vintage Dom Perignon. The guest list was a who's who of political powerhouses, Wall Street titans, and old money aristocrats. Beatrice arrived on Nathaniel's arm. She had decided against buying a new dress, opting instead to wear the same vintage Givenchy gown her grandmother had worn to a royal coronation in the 1960s. It was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk, devoid of sequins or flashy embellishments, but the cut and drape were flawless. Around her neck, tucked discreetly beneath the neckline, hung a simple silver chain holding her grandfather's signet ring. As they walked down the grand staircase, cameras flashed. Nathaniel looked incredibly handsome in his custom tuxedo, but his smile was strained. The pressure of his father's impending corporate crisis was weighing heavily on him. "You look beautiful," Nathaniel whispered, squeezing her hand. "Just stick by me tonight, okay? My dad is a nervous wreck about this Rothford announcement." "I wouldn't leave your side," Beatrice replied, her voice steady. They hadn't even reached the bottom of the stairs before Eleanor Sterling intercepted them. She was draped in diamonds that looked heavy enough to cause neck trauma. "Nathaniel, darling, Richard needs you in the VIP lounge immediately." "The mayor is asking about the zoning permits," Eleanor demanded, physically stepping between Nathaniel and Beatrice. "Mom, I just got here with B. Now, Nathaniel, business first. Beatrice can entertain herself. We wouldn't want her to feel overwhelmed by all this." "Importance," Eleanor said, flashing a venomous smile. Nathaniel gave Beatrice an apologetic look. "5 minutes, okay? Grab a drink. I'll be right back." As soon as Nathaniel disappeared into the crowd, Eleanor's smile vanished. The mask of polite high society fell away entirely. She grabbed Beatrice by the elbow, her perfectly manicured nails digging painfully into the silk of Beatrice's gown. "Walk with me," Eleanor hissed. She dragged Beatrice away from the flashing cameras and the string quartet, pushing through a set of heavy mahogany doors into a deserted, dimly lit private antechamber off the main ballroom. Waiting inside were Richard Sterling, looking red-faced and stressed, and Chloe, who was sipping a martini and leaning against a leather armchair. Beside Chloe stood Victoria Harrington, Nathaniel's ex, looking smug in a glittering, custom-made Versace gown. "What is this?" Beatrice asked, keeping her tone perfectly level. She gently but firmly detached her arm from Eleanor's grip. Richard stepped forward, pulling a slender leather checkbook from his breast pocket. He didn't even bother looking Beatrice in the eye. "Let's skip the pleasantries, Miss Hayes. I am a busy man, and tonight is the most important night of my career." Nathaniel is confused. He thinks he's in love with you because you represent some quaint, bohemian rebellion against his upbringing. "Mr. Sterling, Nathaniel and I love each other. It has nothing to do with rebellion," Beatrice said, feeling a cold knot form in her stomach. She had expected hostility, but not an ambush. "Please," Chloe snorted, rolling her eyes. "You're a bookbinder. You probably clip coupons. Nate is going to inherit an empire. He needs a partner who understands the weight of that. Someone like Victoria." Victoria offered a sympathetic, deeply patronizing pout. "It's nothing personal, Beatrice. But Nathaniel is destined for greatness. You're holding him back. He needs a wife who can navigate state dinners, not someone who smells like old library books." Richard uncapped a solid gold Mont Blanc fountain pen. "I've run background checks on you, Beatrice. You have no assets, no significant familial connections, no trust fund. You are a financial liability. But I am a generous man." He scribbled rapidly on the check, tore it from the book, and held it out to her. $500,000, Richard stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "Tax-free. It's more money than you'll see in a lifetime. Take the check, walk out the back door of this hotel, and never contact my son again." Beatrice looked down at the slip of paper. $500,000. To the Sterlings, it was a rounding error. To ordinary people, it was life-changing. To Lady Beatrice Cavendish, whose personal net worth eclipsed the gross domestic product of small nations, it was a profound insult. She didn't reach for it. She just looked up at Richard. "And if I refuse?" Eleanor's face contorted into a mask of pure rage. She stepped forward, practically vibrating with indignation. "If you refuse, you little gold-digging tramp, I will personally ensure you are ruined. I will buy the building your pathetic little shop is in and evict you. I will make sure no one in this city ever hires you for a restoration job again. I will crush you until you are begging to take a fraction of this money." "Mom, look at her dress," Chloe sneered, gesturing with her martini glass. "She probably bought it at a thrift store. She's desperate." In her dramatic flourish, Chloe stumbled. It was entirely deliberate. The martini glass tipped forward, and a splash of cranberry-tinted vodka splashed violently across the bodice of Beatrice's vintage Givenchy gown. "Oh, my goodness, I am so clumsy," Chloe gasped, though her eyes danced with malicious glee. I'm so sorry, Bee. It probably doesn't cost much to dry clean polyester, right? Beatrice looked down at the stain. The dress had survived 50 years of pristine preservation, only to be defiled by a spoiled child throwing a tantrum. A heavy, dangerous silence descended upon the room. Beatrice took a slow, deep breath. She reached into her clutch, pulled out a linen handkerchief, and calmly dabbed at the stain. You are quite right, Eleanor, Beatrice said softly, her voice carrying a terrifyingly calm authority that made Richard blink in surprise. People like me do not belong in your world. She looked directly at Richard, her gaze piercing right through his arrogant facade. You talk of legacy, Mr. Sterling. You talk of empires. But your foundation is crumbling, isn't it? You're leveraged to the hilt. You're desperate for a bailout. You think money gives you class, but all it has given you is the delusion of superiority. How dare you speak to my husband that way? Eleanor shrieked. Keep your check, Mr. Sterling, Beatrice continued, ignoring Eleanor entirely. She smoothed the skirt of her stained dress. You are going to need every penny. Before Richard could formulate a retort to her audacity, the heavy mahogany doors swung open. Nathaniel burst into the room, looking panicked. There you are. I've been looking everywhere. He stopped dead in his tracks, taking in the scene. The hostility hanging in the air was palpable. He saw the check still clutched in his father's hand. He saw the dark stain on Beatrice's dress. Dad, what is going on here? Nathaniel's voice dropped an octave, a dangerous edge creeping in. What did you do? We are handling a situation, Nathaniel, Richard said gruffly. This woman is a parasite. We are severing ties. Nathaniel stepped in front of Beatrice, shielding her from his family. You offered her money? Are you insane? I love her. I told you to leave her alone. Nate, be reasonable, Victoria purred, stepping forward to touch his arm. She doesn't belong here. Look at her. Nathaniel shook Victoria off, violently. He turned to Beatrice, his eyes filled with sorrow and fury. Bea, I am so sorry. I didn't know they would do this. Let's go. We're leaving. He grabbed her hand, fully prepared to walk away from his family, his inheritance, and his entire life in that single moment. It was all the proof Beatrice needed. Her heart swelled. Nathaniel had passed the ultimate test, one he didn't even know he was taking. Nathaniel Sterling, Richard roared, his face purple. If you walk out that door with her, you are cut off. You will not see a dime of my money, and you will lose your position at the company. Do not throw away your future for a nobody. Beatrice gently squeezed Nathaniel's hand, halting his exit. She looked up at him, her eyes softening. Wait, Bea? No, I'm done with them. I'm done with all of this, Nathaniel said, his jaw clenched. Just wait, Beatrice repeated, her voice taking on a completely different cadence, a polished, aristocratic tilt she had suppressed for years. The gala is just getting to the best part. From the main ballroom, the booming voice of the master of ceremonies echoed through the sound system, penetrating the thick walls of the private room. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, we have reached the most anticipated moment of the evening. Sterling Global is honored to announce a historic partnership. Richard's posture immediately straightened. The anger on his face was replaced by a look of desperate anticipation. This was the moment his company would be saved. He adjusted his tie. You see, Nathaniel, Richard said, a frantic kind of joy in his eyes. This is what matters. The Rothford estate, $1 billion injection. We are about to become untouchable. We are exceptionally privileged tonight, the announcer continued, the crowd falling into a hushed, reverent silence. To have the sole benefactor, the majority shareholder, and the absolute head of the Rothford Trust with us in person. Eleanor quickly wiped the scowl off her face, preparing to re-enter the ballroom to greet European royalty. She glared at Beatrice one last time. Get out of here before security drags you out. You are not fit to be in the same room as our new partner. Beatrice didn't move an inch. She just smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator watching a trap snap shut. Please be upstanding, the announcer's voice boomed, bouncing off the chandeliers, and join me in welcoming Her Grace, Lady Beatrice Arabella Cavendish, Duchess of Rothford. The words hung in the air of the private room like a dropped bomb. For 10 agonizing seconds, the private antechamber felt devoid of oxygen. The booming applause from the grand ballroom filtered through the heavy mahogany doors, a surreal soundtrack to the absolute paralysis gripping the Sterling family. Richard Sterling's hand, still outstretched with the $500,000 check, began to tremble. His brain, wired for market fluctuations and hostile takeovers, simply short-circuited. He looked from the door to the speakers and finally to the young woman standing calmly before him, dabbing a cranberry stain on her vintage silk dress. "Is this?" Eleanor started, her voice a reedy, high-pitched gasp. She clutched her diamond necklace as if it were a life preserver. "Is this a prank? Nathaniel, what kind of sick joke are you playing?" Nathaniel looked just as bewildered as his parents. He stared at Beatrice, his mouth slightly parted. "Bae? What is the announcer talking about?" Before Beatrice could answer, the double doors swung wide open. The deafening roar of the ballroom washed over them, but it was the three men who entered that commanded the room's attention. Leading them was Arthur Pendleton, immaculate in a bespoke Savile Row tuxedo, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. Flanking him were two massive men with earpieces private security details that made the Beaumont Hotel's bouncers look like crossing guards. Arthur's eyes swept the room, pausing with icy disapproval on the spilled drink and the check in Richard's hand. Before settling on Beatrice, he bowed his head, a gesture of profound and genuine deference. "My lady," Arthur said, his crisp British baritone cutting through the chaos. "The board is assembled. The press is waiting. Whenever you are ready." The check fluttered from Richard's fingers, landing face down on the Persian rug. The color drained from his face so rapidly, he looked as though he might faint. You are," he stammered, the realization finally crashing through his arrogance. "Lady Beatrice Arabella Cavendish." Arthur supplied helpfully, stepping to Beatrice's side. "Duchess of Rothford, primary beneficiary of the Rothford Trust, and the singular entity holding the capital necessary to save Sterling Global from total insolvency." Victoria Harrington stumbled backward, the heel of her designer stiletto catching on the carpet. She grabbed the back of a leather chair for support, her smugness entirely evaporated. Chloe let out a small, strangled squeak, her eyes fixed in sheer terror on the cranberry stain she had deliberately poured onto a woman who could buy and sell her entire bloodline before breakfast. Beatrice turned to Nathaniel. The anger and coldness in her eyes melted away, replaced by a profound tenderness. She reached out and took his hand. "I wanted to tell you," Beatrice said softly, entirely ignoring the hyperventilating billionaires surrounding them. "Every day, I wanted to tell you, but I needed to know that you loved me for the quiet girl in the bookshop. I needed to know you would choose me over the empire." Nathaniel swallowed hard. He looked at Arthur, then at the security detail, and finally back to the woman he loved. "You own the Rothford estate? The European land? The banks? All of it?" "I do," Beatrice nodded. "And my grandfather's trust has been approached to bail out your father's company. A company, it seems, that is built on sand and cruelty." She let go of Nathaniel's hand and turned her attention back to Richard and Eleanor. Her posture shifted. The quiet, unassuming bookbinder vanished. In her place stood a woman raised in ancestral castles, educated by ruthless financial tutors, and bred to command. The transformation was terrifying. "You pride yourselves on legacy, Mr. Sterling," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, silken whisper. "But your legacy is nothing more than leveraged debt and terrible manners. You offered me $500,000 to disappear. I spend that much annually preserving historical archives in London." Eleanor took a hesitant step forward, attempting a sickeningly sweet, albeit terrified, smile. "Beatrice, Your Grace, we had no idea. If we had known your pedigree, your standing, you would have treated me with basic human decency." Beatrice cut her off, her tone sharp enough to draw blood. "That is precisely the problem, Eleanor. You only respect power. You only value people by the zeros in their bank accounts. And Chloe, Beatrice shifted her gaze to the younger Sterling, who physically shrank back. Next time you decide to ruin a woman's dress, ensure it isn't an original Hubert de Givenchy piece, worn by my grandmother, the previous Duchess, to the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. The dry cleaning bill alone will likely exceed your monthly allowance. Arthur checked his pocket watch. My lady, Silas Montgomery, and the rest of the Sterling board are growing anxious. Let them wait, Beatrice replied calmly. She looked at Richard, whose chest was heaving with panic. Mr. Sterling, you required a public appearance to stabilize your stock. I am a woman of my word. Shall we? Without waiting for his reply, Beatrice turned and walked out the door, flanked by her security. Nathaniel, after a moment of stunned hesitation, ran a hand through his hair and followed her, leaving his family standing in the ruins of their own hubris. The grand ballroom fell dead silent the moment Beatrice stepped through the archway. The master of ceremonies stood at the podium, sweating slightly under the stage lights. Silas Montgomery, the grizzled, formidable chairman of the Sterling Global Board, stood nearby, holding the ceremonial contract. Thousands of eyes tracked Beatrice as she walked down the center aisle. Whispers erupted like a lit fuse. She wasn't wearing diamonds. She wasn't draped in designer labels. She wore a vintage dress stained with vodka and cranberry juice. Yet she carried herself with an imperious, undeniable authority. Nathaniel walked a few paces behind her, acting not as a conquering corporate prince, but as her loyal guard. Richard, Eleanor, Chloe, and Victoria scrambled out of the antechamber, rushing to their VIP table near the stage. They looked like prisoners of war being marched to the gallows. Beatrice ascended the short staircase to the stage. Silas Montgomery, a man who had notoriously never bowed to anyone in his 60 years on Wall Street, extended his hand and offered a polite, deeply respectful nod. Your Grace, Silas said into the microphone, Sterling Global is profoundly honored by your presence. The terms of our partnership have been heavily negotiated by your legal counsel, and we are ready to finalize the European expansion. Beatrice took the microphone. She looked out over the sea of billionaires, politicians, and socialites. Then, she looked down at Richard Sterling, who was gripping the edge of his table so hard his knuckles were white. Thank you, Mr. Montgomery. Beatrice's voice echoed through the cavernous room, smooth and perfectly modulated. The Rothford Trust has always believed in strategic alliances. We look for potential, for growth, and above all, for integrity in leadership. She paused, letting the word integrity hang in the air. Richard visibly flinched. Over the past few weeks, I have had the unique opportunity to observe the leadership of Sterling Global up close. I have experienced the hospitality of the Sterling family firsthand. Beatrice gestured gracefully to the dark stain blooming across her bodice. Cameras flashed in rapid succession, immortalizing the ruined silk. It has been an incredibly enlightening experience. Eleanor buried her face in her hands. Chloe looked as though she might vomit. The Rothford estate is prepared to inject the necessary capital to save Sterling Global from its current, undisclosed liquidity crisis, Beatrice continued, causing a shockwave of gasps to ripple through the room. Richard had kept the impending bankruptcy a strict secret from the public. Exposing it here was a lethal strike. However, Beatrice said, her voice turning to steel, the terms negotiated yesterday are no longer acceptable. Silas Montgomery frowned, stepping forward. Your Grace, the contracts are drawn. You demanded 51% voting rights and board representation. I did, Beatrice agreed. But I am amending my conditions. The Rothford Trust will provide the bailout. We will assume the 51% controlling interest. But I will not invest a single pound into this company while Richard Sterling remains Chief Executive Officer. Total pandemonium broke out in the ballroom. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Board members at the front tables began shouting over one another. Richard leapt from his chair, his face a mask of pure fury. You can't do that, Richard roared, forgetting the microphones, the cameras, and the crowd. I built this company. You over-leveraged this company, Mr. Sterling. Beatrice corrected him coldly from the stage. Your ego drove it to the brink of collapse, and your lack of basic morality makes you unfit to manage my family's money. She turned to Silas Montgomery, who was frantically calculating the legal ramifications in his head. Mr. Montgomery, the offer stands for exactly 60 seconds. Richard Sterling steps down as CEO, effectively immediately, and relinquishes his board seat. Furthermore, he and his wife, Eleanor, are to have zero operational control or access to company funds. And who takes his place? Silas demanded, his voice cracking over the sound system. We cannot decapitate the company without a successor. Beatrice looked down off the stage, her eyes locking onto Nathaniel. He was staring at her, wide-eyed, the magnitude of what she was doing washing over him. She wasn't just destroying his father, she was clearing the board for him. The Rothford Trust nominates Nathaniel Sterling as the new Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Global, Beatrice announced. He possesses the one thing his father lacks, a conscience. She lowered the microphone and looked at Silas. 50 seconds, Mr. Montgomery, or the Rothford Trust withdraws, and Sterling Global files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on Monday morning. The choice is yours. The silence in the Beaumont Hotel's grand ballroom was no longer reverent. It was suffocating, heavy with the metallic tang of corporate bloodshed. A room filled with the most powerful people in the Western Hemisphere watched, utterly paralyzed, as a 26-year-old book restorer held a billion-dollar guillotine over the neck of Richard Sterling. 40 seconds, Mr. Montgomery, Beatrice's voice, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system, was eerily calm. She didn't look angry. She looked like a surgeon preparing to excise a tumor. Silas Montgomery, chairman of the board, wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. He was a veteran of Wall Street, a man who had survived the 2008 crash and countless hostile takeovers. He knew the math. He knew Richard had leveraged the company's core assets to fund his reckless expansion into Asian markets the previous year, a gamble that had failed catastrophically. The Rothford Capital wasn't just an expansion fund, it was a lifeline. Without it, the company's stock would be worthless by Tuesday. Silas, you can't be taking this seriously, Richard bellowed, his voice cracking, stripping away the last veneer of his aristocratic pretense. He scrambled toward the stage, his face flushed a dangerous, mottled purple. She is a child, a manipulative little. 30 seconds, Arthur Pendleton interrupted smoothly, stepping to the edge of the stage. He opened a slim, black leather briefcase and produced a single sheet of paper. I have the withdrawal of intent, drafted and signed by Her Grace. I need only to date it, and the Rothford estate's legal obligation to Sterling Global vanishes entirely. Don't you dare, Eleanor shrieked from the VIP table, her diamond necklaces clattering as she grabbed the arm of Margaret Chen, the company's chief risk officer. Margaret, do something. Call security. Margaret Chen slowly peeled Eleanor's manicured fingers off her arm. Margaret's eyes were locked on Beatrice. Security works for the hotel, Eleanor. And frankly, considering the debt covenants we are about to breach, we can't afford to pay them anyway. Margaret stood up, smoothing her skirt. She looked directly at Silas Montgomery. Silas, the risk assessment is absolute. We take the deal, or we file for Chapter 11. I vote to accept Her Grace's terms. You backstabbing, Richard roared, lunging toward Margaret, but two of Beatrice's private security contractors smoothly intercepted him, placing massive, unyielding hands on his shoulders. 20 seconds, Beatrice noted, her eyes flicking to the massive Rolex on Silas's wrist. Silas, Richard pleaded, panic finally overriding his rage. We've been partners for 20 years. You know me. You know my vision. Silas looked at Richard, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated capitalism. Friendship in this room was a currency, and Richard's account was overdrawn. Your vision, Richard, has put us $3 billion in the red, Silas said, his voice dropping into a deadly, gravelly register. You lied to the board about the liquidity of the domestic assets. You lied about the quarterly projections. You were banking on a blind bailout from a European trust. Well, the trust isn't blind, and she is standing right in front of us. Silas turned his back on Richard and faced the front tables where the remaining 9 board members sat in stunned silence. Harrison Fordyce, an 80-year-old Boston Brahmin who controlled the largest block of voting shares outside the Sterling family, slowly pushed his chair back and stood. "I second Margaret's motion," Harrison rasped, tapping his cane on the marble floor. "Richard has steered this ship into the rocks. The boy, Nathaniel, has been running the logistics division flawlessly for 3 years. He has a level head. He doesn't have his father's. Reckless ego. I vote to accept the terms. Richard is out. Nathaniel is in." A murmur of agreement rippled through the VIP section. The sharks smelled blood in the water, and they were turning on their wounded leader to save themselves. "10 seconds," Arthur Pendleton said, unscrewing the cap of his fountain pen. "Vote," Silas barked into his own microphone, overriding the whispers of the crowd. "All in favor of restructuring the executive board per the terms of the Rothford Trust, signifying the immediate termination of Richard Sterling as CEO, say aye." A chorus of ayes erupted from the front tables. It wasn't just a majority, it was unanimous. The board members weren't just saving the company. They were actively distancing themselves from the radioactive fallout of Richard's failure. "The motion carries," Silas announced heavily. He looked up at Beatrice, bowing his head once more. "Your Grace, the company is yours." And Nathaniel's? Richard Sterling collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands. The man who had entered the Beaumont Hotel as an untouchable titan of industry had been stripped of his power, his company, and his dignity in less than 3 minutes. Eleanor let out a long, theatrical wail, burying her face in Chloe's shoulder. Chloe, however, was staring blankly at the stained vintage Givenchy dress on the stage, the reality of her own actions finally penetrating her thick skull. She hadn't just bullied her brother's girlfriend. She had assaulted the most powerful investor in their hemisphere. Beatrice nodded at Silas. "A wise decision, Mr. Montgomery. Arthur will provide the finalized contracts in the morning." She handed the microphone back to the master of ceremonies, who took it with trembling hands. Beatrice didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply turned and walked down the stage steps, her security detail parting the sea of stunned billionaires to create a path for her. Nathaniel, who had stood frozen through the entire execution, finally moved. He didn't look back at his father. He didn't look at his mother. He jogged down the steps, catching up to Beatrice, just as she reached the exit of the ballroom. "Bea," he breathed, catching her arm. She turned, looking up at him. The cold, aristocratic mask slipped, revealing the quiet, thoughtful woman he had fallen in love with in the bookshop. "Are you angry with me?" she asked softly. Nathaniel looked at the ballroom behind them, then back to her. "Angry? Bea? You just handed me an empire and saved it from ruin." But more importantly, he reached out, gently touching the cranberry stain on her dress. "You stood up for yourself. You stood up for us. They gave me no choice, Nathaniel. It was you or their vanity. I chose you." Nathaniel smiled, a genuine, relieved smile that reached his eyes. "Let's get out of here. I think I've had enough high society for one lifetime." The transition of power was as brutal as it was swift. While the orchestra in the ballroom tentatively resumed playing a Mozart concerto to cover the awkward murmurs of the elite, the real business was happening in the hotel's executive suites. Nathaniel and Beatrice sat on a plush velvet sofa, surrounded by a small army of Rothford estate lawyers and Sterling Global board members. Silas Montgomery pushed a towering stack of heavily redacted folders across the glass coffee table. "These are the true financials, Nathaniel," Silas said, looking 10 years older than he had an hour ago. "Your father kept 2 sets of books, the ones he showed the board, and the ones that reflected the catastrophic losses in the Macau casino developments. We were 6 weeks away from missing payroll for 80,000 employees." Nathaniel leafed through the documents, his jaw tightening. "He mortgaged the pension funds?" Nathaniel's voice was a low, dangerous whisper. He actually leveraged the employee pensions for a real estate gamble? He was desperate, Arthur Pendleton interjected, standing behind Beatrice with his hands clasped behind his back. Desperation breeds profound moral flexibility in men like your father, but that is no longer your concern. The Rothford Trust is injecting $2 billion at dawn. The pensions are secure. The debt will be restructured under my supervision. Beatrice watched Nathaniel carefully. He was absorbing a lifetime of betrayal in a matter of minutes. The father he had idolized, or at least respected, was a fraud. A sharp knock on the suite door interrupted the somber meeting. One of Beatrice's security guards opened it a crack, then looked back at Beatrice. "Your Grace, there is a Miss Harrington requesting entry. She says she is a personal friend of the new CEO." Beatrice arched an eyebrow and looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel let out a dry, humorless laugh. Victoria Harrington. Of course. Now that he was the undisputed king of Sterling Global, rather than just the heir apparent to a failing kingdom, the shipping heiress was suddenly interested again. "Let her in," Nathaniel said, his voice cold. Victoria swept into the room, her glittering Versace gown catching the light. She completely ignored the lawyers, Silas Montgomery, and even Beatrice. She made a beeline straight for Nathaniel, a predatory, sympathetic pout on her glossy lips. "Nate, darling," Victoria cooed, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I came as soon as I heard the final vote. It's so awful what your father did, but I always knew you were the one meant to lead. You need someone by your side who understands this pressure. Someone who can help you navigate the new social landscape." She shot a sideways, dismissive glance at Beatrice. "It's a completely different game now, Nathaniel." Nathaniel looked at the hand on his shoulder, then up at Victoria's perfectly sculpted face. He stood up slowly, forcing her to step back. "You're right, Victoria. It is a completely different game," Nathaniel said loudly, ensuring every lawyer and board member in the room could hear. "And the first rule of this new game is that parasites are no longer welcome at my table." Victoria's jaw dropped. "Nate, do not call me Nate. It's Mr. Sterling." Nathaniel cut her off, his voice echoing his father's authority, but laced with a rigid morality his father never possessed. "An hour ago, you stood in a room and watched my family attempt to bribe and humiliate the woman I love. You laughed at her. You thought her lack of visible wealth made her less than human. You were showing me exactly who you are," Nathaniel said. "Security. Escort Miss Harrington out of the hotel and ensure she is permanently removed from the Sterling Global visitor logs. Her father's shipping contracts will be reviewed by our legal team on Monday. We are likely terminating them." Victoria's face drained of color. The Harrington shipping empire relied heavily on Sterling Global's logistics division. Nathaniel wasn't just rejecting her, he was potentially sinking her family's revenue. She looked to Silas Montgomery for help, but the old board member simply looked away, busying himself with a stack of papers. As the security guard firmly guided a sputtering, humiliated Victoria out of the suite, Nathaniel sat back down next to Beatrice. He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "I'm sorry you had to deal with them," he whispered to her, ignoring the room full of suits. "I'm not," Beatrice replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "It showed me exactly what kind of man you are. You didn't hesitate. You chose me when you thought I had nothing. You never had nothing, B. You had everything that actually mattered." Meanwhile, 3 floors down, the reality of their new existence was crashing down on Richard, Eleanor, and Chloe. They had been escorted out of the ballroom, not by the front doors, where the paparazzi waited, but through the service elevators, flanked by 4 of Beatrice's massive security personnel. They stood in the cold, damp loading dock of the Beaumont Hotel, shivering in their haute couture. "My car," Richard snapped at one of the guards. "Bring my driver around." "I'm sorry, mister." "Sterling," the guard replied, his face entirely impassive. "The Aston Martin, along with the company driver, are assets of Sterling Global. As per the board's immediate injunction, you are no longer permitted to utilize company assets. Your corporate credit cards have been deactivated." Eleanor let out a strangled gasp, clutching her diamond necklace. Deactivated? We have to get back to the Hamptons. The Hamptons estate is technically owned by a shell corporation tied to the Asian Logistics Division. Ma'am, Arthur Pendleton said, stepping out of the shadows of the loading dock. He had come down specifically to deliver the final blow. That asset will be liquidated next week to cover the pension deficit your husband created. You have until Friday to remove your personal belongings. Chloe burst into tears, her mascara running down her face in thick black streaks. Where are we supposed to go? I have a fitting for Fashion Week tomorrow. I suggest you cancel it, Miss Sterling, Arthur said crisply. Your trust fund was also tied to the company stock, which, as of Monday, will be restructured. Your access to liquid capital is currently zero. Richard stepped forward, his fists clenched, but he looked broken. The arrogant Titan was gone, replaced by an aging, desperate man in a very expensive suit. Arthur, please, speak to her. We need a bridge loan. Just enough to secure private housing. Arthur adjusted his cuffs, his expression completely devoid of pity. Your Grace anticipated this request. She has instructed me to offer you a personal check. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a familiar, slender piece of paper. He handed it to Richard. Richard looked down at it. It was the exact same check he had written to Beatrice 2 hours earlier, torn from his own gold-trimmed checkbook. $500,000, Arthur said, echoing Richard's earlier words with chilling precision. Tax-free. It's more money than you'll see in a lifetime. Take the check, Mr. Sterling. Walk out of this loading dock and never attempt to contact your son again. Richard's hands shook violently. He wanted to tear it up. He wanted to throw it in Arthur's face. But he knew, with terrifying certainty, that this $500,000 was the only cash he had left in the world. He slowly, agonizingly, folded the check and slid it into his pocket. Eleanor sobbed openly, leaning against the cold concrete wall of the loading dock. Chloe hid her face in her hands. The Sterling dynasty hadn't just fallen. It had been utterly dismantled by a woman they thought wasn't worth the dirt on their shoes. Good evening, Arthur said, turning on his heel and walking back toward the service elevator. He didn't look back. 6 months later, the crisp autumn air of Boston smelled of roasting chestnuts and impending snow. The small, dust-moted bookshop in downtown Boston was gone. In its place stood the newly inaugurated Rothford Sterling Foundation for Historical Preservation, a massive, state-of-the-art facility taking up half a city block. It was a masterpiece of architectural design, blending historical brickwork with modern, climate-controlled glass vaults. Inside, Beatrice Hayes, she still refused to use her title in her daily life, was exactly where she wanted to be. She wore her faded denim and an oversized knit sweater, her dark hair tied back with a simple tortoiseshell clip. She sat at a large oak workbench, meticulously repairing the binding on a 17th-century naval logbook, using a bone folder to smooth the fresh adhesive. The bell above the glass door chimed, and Nathaniel walked in. He looked different. The strain of his father's corporate shadow was gone from his face. He wore a sharp, custom-tailored suit. He was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. After all, but his tie was loosened, and he carried 2 cardboard cups of coffee from the corner bodega, just like he used to. Under Nathaniel's leadership and the Rothford estate's backing, Sterling Global had undergone a radical transformation. The toxic, cutthroat culture Richard had fostered was dismantled. The Asian division was salvaged, the pensions were secured, and the company had pivoted heavily toward sustainable development and ethical investments. Nathaniel was hailed by the financial press as a visionary, the man who had pulled his family's legacy from the brink of moral and financial bankruptcy. I brought peace offerings, Nathaniel smiled, setting a coffee cup down next to the 17th-century logbook. Extra foam, double shot, just the way you like it. Beatrice looked up, a warm smile spreading across her face. She set down her bone folder and took the coffee. Bribing the archivist? Mr. Sterling? I'm not sure that's ethical. I have it on good authority that the primary shareholder of my company is highly susceptible to caffeine, Nathaniel chuckled, leaning against the edge of the workbench. He reached out, his thumb gently tracing a small smudge of binding glue on her cheek. You missed a spot. Occupational hazard, Beatrice laughed, leaning into his touch. How was the board meeting? Silas Montgomery spent 20 minutes praising the new European quarterly reports. It was nauseatingly positive, Nathaniel said, taking a sip of his coffee. Oh, and Arthur called. The legal paperwork for the Hamptons estate liquidation is finally closed. The property was sold to a tech billionaire from Silicon Valley. They're going to tear down my father's glass monstrosity and build an eco-farm. Beatrice raised an eyebrow. An eco-farm in the Hamptons. Your mother must be absolutely thrilled. Nathaniel's smile faded slightly, replaced by a complex look of lingering sadness and ultimate acceptance. I heard they moved to a 3-bedroom condo in Boca Raton. Chloe had to get a job as an assistant buyer for a mid-tier department store. They are adjusting. He didn't take pleasure in their downfall, but he also refused to let their toxicity back into his life. The $500,000 Beatrice had given them was enough to keep them comfortable, but to people who were used to spending that much on a weekend yacht rental, it was a profound exile. They had learned the harsh reality of the world they had so callously lorded over others. They have what they need to survive, Beatrice said softly, sensing his shift in mood. And they have each other. The rest is up to them. I know, Nathaniel nodded. He set his coffee cup down and turned fully toward her, taking both of her hands in his. His expression grew suddenly serious, a nervous energy radiating from him. What is it? Beatrice asked, her heart giving a little flutter. 6 months ago, you stood in a room full of sharks, and you tore my father's empire to the ground to protect me, Nathaniel said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur. You gave me the power to build something better. But more importantly, you let me see the real you. He reached into his suit pocket. He didn't pull out a velvet box. He didn't drop to one knee in a grand, theatrical gesture. That wasn't who they were. Instead, he pulled out a small, simple ring. It wasn't a massive, ostentatious diamond meant to blind socialites. It was an antique, a beautiful, delicate sapphire, set in platinum, surrounded by tiny, intricate floral engravings. It was a ring with history, a ring with a story, a ring fit for an archivist. I don't care about the titles, Bae, Nathaniel said, his eyes locking onto hers. I don't care about the estates, or the trusts, or the boardrooms. I care about the girl who yelled at me for dropping a first edition of Gatsby. I care about the woman who loves the smell of old paper more than the smell of caviar. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Will you marry me, Beatrice? Not as a merger, not as a partnership, just as my wife. Tears pricked the corners of Beatrice's eyes. She looked down at the sapphire, then up at the man who had willingly walked away from his billions just to hold her hand when she was a nobody. Yes, Beatrice whispered, a brilliant smile breaking through her tears. Yes, Nathaniel, I will. He pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply amidst the smell of aged parchment and binding glue. Outside, the Boston snow began to fall, blanketing the city in quiet, pristine white. The old empire of the Sterlings was dead and buried. The new empire, built not on arrogance and leveraged debt, but on mutual respect, true partnership, and a love that survived the fire, was just beginning. The story of Beatrice and Nathaniel is a powerful reminder that true wealth isn't measured by the labels on our clothes or the balance in our bank accounts, but by the content of our character and the strength of our convictions. It shows that arrogance ultimately builds an empire on sand, while integrity, respect, and a willingness to stand up for what is right build a foundation that can weather any storm. If you were captivated by this tale of hidden identities, corporate justice, and a love that conquered high society snobbery, please hit that like button, share this video with anyone who loves a good karma story, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life drama narratives. We post new stories every week,